Hello, my name is Michael, and I'm excited to present our work on user expectations for NPC interactions and behavior in virtual reality. Non-playable characters, or NPCs, are central to many game experiences. They provide quests, give items, interact with the player, etc., and they make the game world feel alive. Players can also form emotional connections with NPCs, which enhance their connection with the game. Whereas much research into NPCs has been done through the lens of more traditional displays such as monitors, less has been explored from an embodied VR perspective. The medium of VR shifts the nature of presence and embodiment in the player, and we consider how these factors might affect NPC interactions. The design and behavior of NPCs are imperative for the player's experience in a game. Autonomous virtual characters that act realistically can unlock emotionally immersive experiences, and intelligent NPC design has been an enduring area of research. When discussing immersion, virtual reality has been explored as the medium to enhance such feelings. In VR, players can interact as active participants, and their direct embodied inputs are mapped into the system. Putting it all together, how can VR idiosyncratic features learn from and extend upon the corpus of research on realistic NPCs? So our research focuses on 4 key questions. First, we want to understand how player NPC interactions are currently implemented in VR games and how these differ from non-VR games. Second, we aim to identify the key dimensions for designing NPC interactions in VR, considering the unique affordances of the medium. Third, we are interested in what players expect and suggest for NPC interactions in VR. And finally, we compare player expectations with the current implementations to identify gaps and suggest future design directions for creating richer and more immersive NPC interactions in virtual reality. We first want to understand how NPC interactions in games are currently handled, so we performed an observational study on games drawn from Steam. We filtered by the tags VR supported and VR only, and sorted by relevance and top user reviews, choosing games with embodied NPCs. We observed gameplay footage of these games and noted down interactions in an observational coding sheet. Further analysis allowed us to develop 2 main characteristics of NPC interactions that are distinct in VR games. Firstly, physical motion triggers. In games on traditional displays, events are typically triggered automatically by the story or through controller or keyboard buttons. In VR games, the use of motion as input is a unique, distinct feature. Unlike other motion input systems like the Kinect or Wii, the VR system maps motion as a direct form of input into an embodied world. When a player moves the controllers, their embodied avatars are mirrored this motion. Although motion was a possible form of input in VR, it was still rather rare, and some notable examples of its application are shown here. These games feature NPC interactions in which users can physically interact with an NPC, shake or nod their head to respond, or point and pull an NPC to start an interaction, showing different ways physical motion is used as input in a game. The second point was player constraints. In non-VR games, it's common to lock the player into an interaction, locking them into place until they complete the dialogue. Game developers might want a player to hear important dialogue woven into the story or the mechanics of the game. However, this forced stasis runs counter to the nature of embodied motion in VR. We observed that interactions with NPCs are varied regarding constraints on locomotion and dialogue completion. In some games, you can walk away freely, and walking far away ends an interaction. In some games, your locomotion locks until you complete the full interaction. Nonetheless, actual motion restriction of one's character within the game was rare. The key difference lies in direct input in VR, which maps physical to virtual motions, constrained by the user's physical abilities, potentially causing desyncs if moves are disallowed. In contrast, indirect input, for example button mappings, can logically be refused if they cause desyncs. The emphasis on direct input in virtual reality is a crucial design aspect for developers to consider. To extend on these findings, we conducted a user study with 80 participants involving semi-structured interviews in the VR environment, where participants interacted with a virtual agent controlled by a researcher. This allowed us to explore user expectations and perceptions of NPC interactions, particularly focusing on the nuances introduced by the medium. Conducting the studies in VR provided participants with a tangible frame of reference, especially for those who might not be as familiar with the medium. The interviews were analyzed using thematic analysis to develop themes, and we present a subset of the most salient findings here. Firstly, we explore using physical motion such as gesturing as an interaction trigger in VR, contrasting it with traditional button-based triggers. Many participants found gesturing more realistic for interacting with NPCs. For example, waving felt more natural than pressing buttons, which doesn't reflect real-world interactions. However, participants also noted challenges with gesturing, including how to choose which NPCs to gesture to and how to signal interactable characters. They emphasized the need for clear indications of interactable NPCs and well-designed gestures to prevent accidental or difficult interactions. Another challenge was the intuitiveness for a new VR user accustomed to traditional controls. Furthermore, participants suggested that interactions should feel natural, ensuring NPCs and players can see each other before initiating an interaction, which aligns with real-life expectations. Overall, achieving realistic interaction in VR requires careful consideration of gesture design and user expectations. Returning to our discussion on player constraints, participants noted that interaction constraints on locomotion in VR present a trade-off between a game's agency and a player's agency. Locking the player in place during dialogue can reduce and restrict their physical freedom, and being unable to move can feel frustrating and contrary to the immersive experience VR should offer. However, some participants recognize that these constraints might be necessary to ensure players engage with important story elements, reflecting the developer's control over the narrative. A common compromise suggests with creating an enclosed boundary for interactions, allowing movement within a defined area while ensuring players remain engaged, whereas a visualized radius enhancing intentionality and preventing accidental navigation out of the interaction zone. So the prior findings also applied to the NPCs. Players highlighted how NPCs could use facial expressions, body language, and gestures to communicate, similar to the players. This could include waving or pointing to initiate interaction, or using hand signals to end it. Given the challenges of perspective and movement freedom in VR, where players might not always be looking at the NPC, additional cues like sound or visual indicators could be necessary. The modifiable distance between the user and NPC in VR enhances the realism of interactions. A close proximity afforded by VR can allow for a synchronous portrayal of emotions through body language and facial expressions, making interactions more immersive and intuitive. So when we contextualize our findings into past research into intelligent NPCs, it seems evident that developers should try to take advantage of the physical and spatial affordances of the medium to enhance NPC interactions. To develop realistic NPCs that follow human behavior, we point towards the wide range of research in social VR that discusses precisely this. However, we do note that there are challenges. Firstly, how do we decode the physical inputs into useful data? There are open challenges in design gestures in terms of learnability, accessibility, and standardization across VR systems. Beyond gestures, if you want to use body language as an input, how can we realistically translate that into emotion and intention? Furthermore, how can we, and when is it appropriate to use it? Should body language be a continuous form of input, and if so, at what point might players feel overwhelmed by being constantly monitored and tracked in-game? So all in all, our observational study uncovered salient dimensions for NPC interactions in VR, focusing on the aspect of physical emotion and body language. The interview studies affirmed that players expected these characteristics in VR to drive physical interactions to enhance realism. But when we consider why these are not always present in current games despite expectations, we come across existing challenges and open questions regarding how people's physical input should be decoded into intention and how it should be used in the game during NPC interactions, forming directions for future research. That concludes the presentation, and thank you for listening.